Thank you again for having me here. It's wonderful being on a panel where you know everybody you've worked close with as well. A lot of food for thought here. Once again, my name is Tauseef Akbar. I work with CARE Chicago. I help develop the research department there, as far as what kind of topics we're going to look into, analyze, discuss. And today I'm going to, a lot of the panelists have already discussed how the media has, how it operates, how it works, which stories they're missing, which are underreported, action items to, kind of affect change and to be part of, this burgeoning, what I would call like a Muslim renaissance in terms of engagement. And so, first of all, I want to start off with talking about what Islamophobia is and is not. It's not about, you have to like the fact that Muslims don't eat bacon, or, you don't have to worry about being Islamophobic if you like eating bacon. That's not what we're talking about, and most of you know that. Most people get that. But what Islamophobia actually is an ideological formation that facilitates American empire and promotes certain political and economic goals. And I want us to understand this point, that this isn't just about isolated incidences of hate crimes or isolated incidences of bigotry, but in fact, there's a project going on. For instance, when we talk about Breitbart and the fact that the chief editor, one of the founders, Stephen Bannon, is actually chief advisor to Trump. This is not by happenstance. This is not just a coincidence. This is a political project. And so I would also want to draw your attention to Hope Not Hate is an organization. When you guys get a chance, look into their recent report about Breitbart's attempt to replicate what they did in the United States within Europe. For instance, the Brexit, some of you may be familiar with, before Trump got elected, there was this move in the UK where voters voted to leave the EU. The EU has been a prosperous thing for Europe. It's been something that has unified it in many ways. And many people were scratching their heads here, pundits, like, why is Europe, why is the UK leaving the European Union? And in fact, Breitbart had a role to play there, as well as other right-wing media. Their chief editor in the UK, Raheem Kassam, who is part of this neocon wing of so-called ex-Muslim, Muslim reformers, he actually took on becoming the chief advisor to UKIP, which is the United Kingdom Independence Party, which was one of the chief political parties that moved the propaganda within the UK and pushed other political parties further right and to capitalize on this effort to leave the EU. The UKIP wasn't successful in terms of how many votes they got, but their main goal, Breitbart's main goal of Brexit, or leaving the EU, was achieved. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, is the influence of these groups is not just something by coincidence. It is a serious political project that they're also trying to replicate. Now they have offices opened up in Germany and France, and those elections are coming up as well. And so getting back to this aspect, the two aspects of Islamophobia, being domestically and abroad. Abroad, you have the war on terror, you have these invasions of nations of Iraq and Afghanistan, you have the drone attacks, the drone warfare that we've all been accustomed to, and many of us are desensitized or don't know much about. And just a point of fact, 4 million Iraqis and Afghanis have died in these wars in the past 2 decades. You can go to Physicians for Social Responsibility. You can look at also the reports by Lancet. And this is not something that just started after 9/11, bear in mind. This began with the Gulf War, this terrorizing and destruction of the region. Now, the reason I bring this in and why does it tie in so intimately with the media and media's role, and as well as how it relates to Islamophobia. So if you recall, in 2003, in the lead up to the Iraq War, you had polling done of Americans regarding their support of these wars. You had 75% of Americans who believed that Iraq was responsible for 9/11. Now, why is this the case? You know, Bill mentioned the whole propaganda about weapons of mass destruction. You know, there was the issue of the uranium and so forth, that, you know, this fictitious uranium that Iraq was fertilizing or what have you. And, you know, the only way I feel that you can somehow conflate Iraq and Afghanistan, or Iraq and bin Laden, is to think that all Muslims are the same. And you had a lead up to this war in which 9/11 and Iraq were serendipitously conflated consistently and with an unquestioning media. So when you talk about the media guilt, you know, there was even some of that after, you know, the stuff hit the fan in Iraq. But are we going to be able to capitalize in this present moment? It's still, you know, a wait and see type of thing. Quickly, domestically, you know, I'm just going to run through some of the major problematic issues that have come up as a result of the lack of media scrutiny, the lack of the critical eye, the intimate nature of the connection between media and the propagation of Islamophobia over the past few years. So you had the passage of the Patriot Act. You had NSEERS, which saw the upending of communities. I come from a community in Chicago which was predominantly Indo-Pak, and you know, right there in Rogers Park, you know, not far from Devon Avenue, where many of you may have gone to, you know, get your biryani or what have you. And people I grew up with, who I played sandlot baseball with, or we hit the basketball courts at Warren Park, overnight, you know, the demand with NSEERS was that you would register with Naturalization Services, right? And overnight, these individuals, some of whom were undocumented, some of whom did not have citizenship, their lives were turned upside down. I have friends whose family sold property completely, you know, who had, for instance, cab medallions, which may have been worth, you know, 10 times more than what they sold it at. And they fled to Canada. Some who couldn't make it to Canada had to go back to tougher situations in Pakistan or India. And so this has real consequences. That's the point of what I'm trying to get at. You know, from NSEERS, you had increased surveillance of Muslim American communities. This wasn't just something that started now. It started in the Bush era, and even previously there was some of this. Masajid have been targeted with undercover agents. You've had community centers that have been infiltrated in this manner, restaurants and bodegas. Arun Kunzanani, who's written a very excellent book that I would suggest everyone get a chance to look at or see a summary of, notes in his research that there are currently 15,000 spies, and he wrote this back in 2015, 15,000 FBI informants who are on the, what you would call like the, not, you know, the payroll of the FBI. We don't know the exact number that are within the Muslim community, but this number of 15,000 is more than what existed in the time of COINTELPRO. About several times more than what was as far as informants and spies that existed in COINTELPRO in the 70s, which targeted black liberation movements, you know, brown liberation movements that were trying to uplift and better their communities, who were growing and were seen as a threat just because they were reaching a point of enfranchisement. which brings me back to one of the dons of Islamophobia for the past several decades. Daniel Pipes has a famous quotes where he was speaking at the AJC in 2001 and talking about the fear and the anxiety of the presence of Muslims, saying that the increased stature and affluence and enfranchisement of American Muslims presents a danger to American Jews, to non-Muslims. And so this is the logic that you're dealing with. It's a political project that wants to upend and put a halt to the growth and enfranchisement of an up-and-coming minority. We've seen it in the past where it's been done, and it's continued to be done against other communities, black or brown, it doesn't matter. But now you see it hyper-visible with Muslims. Then you have CVE, which used to be called Countering Violent Extremism, but all pretense to this being some sort of equal opportunity look at whatever this polemical term of violent extremism. Now Trump is being obvious about it. That's one good thing. As Malcolm said, I rather deal with the wolf who bares his teeth than hides it, where he is now calling it countering radical Islamic extremism. This is an actual program that the government is involved in, and it's based on a faulty framework, largely on a faulty framework of radicalization or analyzing radicalization taken up from the UK called PREVENT. So it's not based on any sort of real empirical evidence. It ties ideology to be the root cause of terrorism. And once again, if you view this from a political economic lens, you see that the purpose is that, it obscures the fact that there are other root causes. Muslims and Muslim leaders and allies have been screaming this from the beginning. It's not about simply these ideologies or these political Muslim groups. This is about wars that have been continuous in the Muslim world, Muslim majority nations, for decades now. These are the root causes. You can look at the research by Robert Pape, at the University of Chicago, spoken here at American Islamic College several times, presented his research on the reason why terrorism exists in the world today. One thing I want to tie in here as well is, we have this discussion about the motives for why we see so much fake news or lies. Why are these lies propagated? Tahira spoke about the fact that 60% of Americans see Trump as a liar, and I'm curious if there was polling pre-election, how many people saw him as a liar, because I think it's pretty obvious to a lot of us that he's lying. But I think his supporters don't give a damn that he's lying, to be honest with you. So if we go up to 60, 70% of Americans seeing, I don't know if this is going to make a difference. I'm not as optimistic maybe because, when you read people who analyze or who have been very familiar with history, Hannah Arendt, for instance, I want to quote her here where she said, fascists don't lie simply to obscure the truth. They lie to signal what would eventually become truth once they take over. For example, throughout the Trump campaign, he lied that he spread the lie that no vetting exists for Muslims from the Middle East. This is a clear and obvious lie. Anyone who's immigrated to this country can tell you about the rigorous vetting that takes place. What he actually means is all Muslims will be treated as threats. Take another example when he talks about inner city crime being at a record high. We know for a fact that this is not true. It's not at a record high. But what he wants to manifest, and which we will see probably later on in these next 4 years, is an increase in police militarization against black and brown communities and an enforcement of ever greater and more extreme laws that will not help the situation but exacerbate it even more. Keep in mind, it's a political project. And the media has been implicated in this for decades, and I'm glad now, and I definitely agree that there is this sense of guilt. You're seeing a lot more alternative media getting a lot more attention. You're seeing mainstream media catching on. Maybe it's a little too late, but they're catching on, publishing stories, publishing what Muslim daily life is like, what it's like to be Muslim in America. But for too long, whether it was the WMDs, whether it was, these tropes about Muslims being barbaric and savage and violent, they played a part in promoting that. Now they're being eclipsed by Breitbart and these other kind of groups that have their own little bubble of social media and content consumption that is specifically geared toward those who already want to hear that, confirmation bias. And I'm just wondering if we're at a point where it's too late for these mainstream media. That's just a question to put it out there. So going on, you have FBI entrapment. Quite often this FBI entrapment has led to the targeting of mentally disabled folks. You have the example of Rizwan Firdaus. He was targeted by FBI agents who infiltrated his mosque despite the FBI knowing that and concluding that he had mental disabilities. The agent worked to gain the trust of Firdaus. As they grew closer, the agents convinced him to participate in a plot to blow up the Pentagon. These are people who would never have the capacity or the ability or the time, the energy, nigh impossible to commit these acts, procure any sort of, what have you, weaponry. But, the FBI sets up its own trap, finds people who are vulnerable, and gets them into these situations. This is something that happens again and again. You're also seeing the seizure of the assets of Muslim charities that's been going on for decades. Example, Holy Land Foundation case. Now you have the Muslim Brotherhood Terror Bill, which Ted Cruz put in, and it's just a matter of time till Muslim organizations that have been stigmatized and associated by guilt by association as being Muslim Brotherhood front groups, this is the other trope, are going to possibly see, and the organization I work for, CARE Chicago, see their assets frozen. We're not going to go without a fight, but this is definitely down the pipeline. So be aware, keep in mind what's going on, be involved in not allowing this to happen. You have anti-Sharia legislation, which has been going on for decades, tied often to anti-labor laws, voting rights acts. 17% of Republican legislatures have sponsored anti-Sharia bills in the past. 80% sponsored by 80%, which is also tied to anti-labor. So you see an intersection of anti-Sharia laws billed as anti-foreign laws connected to other issues such as voter repression and several other pertinent issues. Currently in Montana, there is a bill waiting the approval of the governor, an anti-Sharia bill, and as well as, I believe, Alabama or Georgia, where it's in the state Senate. It's not just right-wing media, I want to point out. Liberal media has been just as guilty. Bill Maher every week is dehumanizing Muslims, and he's doing it under the pretense of liberalism. Media analysis by ISPU, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, has shown that 80% of media coverage of Islam and Muslims is negative. So what are people going to actually think about Islam and Muslims? Lastly, I just want to wrap up with this, is that, the other factor here, to quote Ibn Rushd, ignorance leads to fear, fear leads to hatred, and hatred leads to violence. This is the equation. It's old as time, and it's continued to happen. And let's not fall for the okie doke. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.